I was applying to law school, it's almost embarrassing the extent to which I didn't really think of myself as a political animal. And I think the most important thing that I learned from law school was to know just enough about how things work. I felt a level of confidence in dipping my toe in those waters and offering opinions on things that I don't know that I would have felt had I not gone to law school. Like the average human being who lives in this country, I think has a really good sense that the systems aren't working for them. The system is designed against the interests of average people, I think is a really empowering revelation. But I do think that sometimes folks who are less close to law as an institution or practice don't fully appreciate how rigged it is. It almost is rigged to the extent that to tell people is to sound paranoid. It is concerning that even from a capitalist perspective, there is no appetite for left media. And I think there are a lot of Americans of all races that have such a hungry appetite for a more pointed critique of power more broadly and want to hear about how racism fits into that broader power dynamic. The best messaging that gets across to persuadable voters is to talk about how racism is a tool to divide us up so that corporate elites can maintain power. And then at some point, we start feeling like insecure about trying to live those values. And there are all of these off-ramps that are provided for us to say it's okay if we aren't doing our best. There's so much power, and it's such a threat to the establishment for people to actually believe that there can be change and that you're not foolish or immature or naive to actually believe that you can change something. And if left media can help solve that collection action problem and get more people onboarded and more people realizing they're not alone, if it can get people participating in something like Force the Vote and planning Medicare for All marches and keeping a movement alive even after everybody in Washington seems to have forgotten about all of the urgency with which we spoke about these progressive issues in the context of the 2016 and 2020 campaigns, then I think we're doing something right. And it feels like a real privilege to be a part of that.
All right. I am so thrilled to be having this conversation building off of that incredible panel that we just heard. I'm really excited to be introducing the magnificent Briahna Joy Gray, a brilliant lawyer and communicator, a personal hero of mine. And Ms. Gray is an HLS alum who worked as a litigator before becoming, as many of y'all know, a senior political editor and hard-hitting political journalist at The Atlantic. She was the national press secretary for the 2020 Bernie Sanders campaign for presidency and named one of the Fortune's 40 Under 40. She's a contributor for Current Affairs and the host of the Bad Faith podcast, which has tens of thousands of subscribers. Welcome, Briahna. I'm so excited to be having you here. And as I could go on because the list of your accolades is endless, but what I admire the most about Ms. Gray is that you're a bold and unrelenting voice on the left, and that's incredible, who really refuses to capitulate to corporate and establishment constraints. Just last night, I was listening to the most recent Bad Faith podcast about a Senate candidate in my home state of Ohio, and I couldn't help but reflect on how grateful I was for that interview, to have someone with a large platform pushing even the progressive candidates to commit to bold action and to answer tough questions, right? So, I think to put it broadly, Ms. Gray recenters political narratives on material conditions and isn't afraid to call out corruption. And that's two things that I think here at The Flaw we're trying to emulate from your work. So I'm so honored to be facilitating this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such a kind introduction. I don't know that my list of accolades is endless. I see a fine period at the end of them, certainly, but I really appreciate your kind words and for inviting me here today.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so I'll push back on that. You have had such a remarkable career and you're just getting started. But I want to actually begin our conversation, and I apologize in advance for this, by bringing you back to your time at HLS. I'm curious, how did your experience at Harvard Law meet or perhaps frustrate some of your expectations? What, if anything, that you did here helped you refine your own theory of change and sense of justice?
I often say that, and I think this is something that many people also feel that back in the olden days, before Bernie and before Obama, I didn't feel like there was as much of a need for folks on the broad left to politicize themselves or understand themselves as something separate and apart from the broad idea of being a liberal or being a Democrat. I like to joke, before Bernie, we were all liberals. It was just one big conglomeration of, not conservative. The politics that existed in my environment when I started college in 2003 was basically Bush bad, Iraq war bad, everyone else good guys, yay, go Jon Stewart. It was very simplistic. So when I was applying to law school, it's almost embarrassing the extent to which I didn't really think of myself as a political animal. I was someone who graduated a year before the recession, didn't really know what she wanted to do, knew she was kind of a good writer, liked to talk, liked to argue, and was one of those who went to law school for those reasons, which, by the way, is exactly what they tell you not to go to law school for. And then when I got here, I just moved and I found my old, like the Harvard Law binder they give you with your acceptance letter in it. And it's, then Dean of Admissions, Toby Stock, saying, I look forward to you pursuing your interest in art law when you get here, which is apparently what I wrote about in my application. So that's what I'm saying. I had really no idea. And I wish in retrospect that I had taken any number of classes that would have helped me to form my political identity or express my political notions. For example, I lament frequently that I never took antitrust, to Vanessa's remarks earlier, to Vanessa's point earlier. However, I will say that there were two classes and two professors in particular that did really help me understand myself as a political creature in more concrete terms than my kind of vague humanism that I had before. It was Professor Lonnie Guinier, the late Lonnie Guinier, with whom I took my first elective law and social movements. And this was, 2008, fall of 2000, or maybe it was spring of 2009. Everyone was in love with Obama. And in that context, she was offering some really legitimate criticisms that bore out in terms of the dangers of representational politics and identity to cover up the broader systemic influence of corporate power and special interest groups. And I'm very grateful for that. And the other professor was Professor Hanson, with whom I had torts. I was in Section 6. But additionally, I took him for corporate law. And I don't know that I would have taken corporate law, but for Professor Hanson teaching it. But the way he taught that course, not just substantively, but really asking us to think about how the law is structured, I've come to learn is very unique in how people teach that particular class. And I reflect frequently, almost daily, on the lessons I learned in that class, and I'm very grateful for it. And I think the most important thing that I learned from law school was to know just enough about how things work and to have just enough exposure to how the big boys play in the corporate environment, having worked at a corporate law firm for 6 years or so before leaving for The Intercept. I felt a level of confidence in dipping my toe in those waters and offering opinions on things that I don't know that I would have felt had I not gone to law school. I think it prepared me to participate and to feel like I was entitled to offer something in various intellectual contexts that can be very intimidating. And so I'm very grateful for that, even though I had my criticisms of the place as well.
You're speaking to a very receptive audience. A lot of Section 6ers in the room, myself included, and obviously all students, or many of us are students of Professor Hanson's. But I think it's interesting that you mention, both classes that you mentioned talk about tackling corporate power, because as a journalist and political commentator, you often take corporate power head on. And I'm curious, as someone trained in the law, what are some of the conventional legal narratives that you're up against in those conversations, and how, especially as a lawyer, do you counter that?
Yeah, it's interesting. What's actually funny is that the longer that I'm doing this and the more people that I speak to in the real world, the more I realize that it's not a translation issue for regular folks. It's not like, let me explain corruption to you. No, I got this. Let me explain to you how the world works. The average voter, the average non-voter, the average human being who lives in this country, I think has a really good sense that the systems aren't working for them. They have a really good sense that money the moneyed interests are an intermediary between the democratic process and their elected officials. That makes it so that very little, if any at all, of the people's will is ever translated into legislation. And so this idea that I had at one point that, if we just explain to people how corporate capture works, and if we just explain to people, how biased these laws are and how they're written by lobbyists, then they'll come around and they'll want to vote for Bernie or whatever it is. The more I interact with people, the more I realize they actually understand that a great deal. Sometimes it's useful to be able to offer specific examples and language to folks, the kind of language that I learned in law school, wherein I learned specifically about legislative capture, where I, had some insight into the extent to which corporate law is expressly designed to protect shareholders in lieu of all these other interests that anybody very intuitively would want to prioritize. I remember very clearly Professor Hanson asking us on an early day of class to say, hey, if you were going to structure the law to protect vulnerable people, what kind of interest groups do you think should be protected? And we're all kind of sitting there, we're green, we're young, we don't really know what to do. And, someone eagerly, like timidly says, I don't know, children? Won't somebody think of the children? I don't know, animals, the environment, all these groups, the elderly, sick, people who can't protect themselves. And then you're hit with the whammy of, in every other corporate law class environment, you are being told that the shareholder is the most vulnerable population that you need to protect. And it was lessons like that. It was a real, just not like especially granular, but really important insights about the way the system is designed against the interests of average people, I think is a really empowering revelation. So it's not that I feel like there's a lot to teach in terms of the world, convincing people that the world is broken. But I do think that sometimes folks who are less close to law as an institution or practice don't fully appreciate how rigged it is. It almost is rigged to the extent that to tell people is to sound paranoid and conspiratorial. And that's the piece that I think is, I'd love to continue to try to translate on Bad Faith Podcast. And also I think really empowers people to not back down when they say, hey, the system is rigged, and a bunch of people on like MSNBC say, no, or Fox say, just work harder, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's not rigged. Look at this one example of someone who made it, because that counter propaganda is extremely strong and it's bipartisan. And the most pernicious thing is that even though most people understand the way corruption works, only on the cable news channels, if you bring up corruption, do people act like they're like you're lobbying a personal attack and like, what, who, me? What, Joe Biden could never be influenced by money. He's above it all. Democrats are above it all. There is this real credulity that exists only among people getting those, $1 million paychecks to be pundits on MSNBC. That credulity is not reflected in real life. And the real problem is that people individually understanding how broken the system is don't feel a sense of connection to each other and don't feel a sense of music, of movement, solidarity, because there are so few opportunities for them to see each other reflected in the popular sphere. And that's what I think is so important about left media. And that's what's so important about, even films like my friend from the campaign, David Sirota's Don't Look Up, these small little moments where people can look around and say, oh, I'm not alone. That's what was so galvanizing, I think, about the Bernie campaign, where people at town halls and were at town halls and saw them on TV and realized I shouldn't be embarrassed about the fact that I'm in medical debt. In fact, 40% of families where someone gets cancer go into medical debt. 50% of all bankruptcies in America are the consequence of medical debt. This isn't my personal failure. I'm not alone. And that sense of solidarity, and being empowered to, speak up about the fact that your failures are not personal, but systemic, is so important. And that empowerment, I think, comes in part from the specific knowledge of the systems that you learn from law school.
I so appreciate that intervention. I think it's a really important one that often gets sort of obfuscated in like elite institutions like Harvard Law School, which is that a lot of folks are seeing these failures all around them and that it doesn't need to be severely dumbed down. But I also think I'm so glad you brought up your podcast because on it, you often talk about the power and the pitfalls of media as the fourth estate. You mentioned corporate, corruption of the corporate media. And I know you've brought on journalists like Jordan Sheridan, who covered much of the Flint water crisis and who spoke to you about the role of mainstream media and often burying that story, right? So like, I know Jordan Sheridan ended up founding his own independent outlet, Status Quo. You have your own platform, Bad Faith Pod. And I think to some extent, here at HLS, we're trying to launch our own microcosm of independent investigative journalism with The Flaw. So I wanted to ask, why did you choose to produce your podcast independently? You spoke on this a little bit, but if we could drill in a little bit on, what role you think independent investigative journalism plays in the fourth estate.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have a career in journalism but for independent journalism. And I know there are legitimate and substantive critiques of an institution like The Intercept, but I don't know that anybody else would have reached out to hire me. So The Intercept is funded by a billionaire, Pierre Oudemiriard, and that's not great. But it also is different than other kinds of institutions that are funded by advertising models or owned by other less quote unquote benevolent billionaires. Insofar as that it is a organization ostensibly with a Chinese wall that allows reporters to do the kind of investigative reporting that you don't see at other places. And so when Ryan Grimm reached out to me and pulled me out of nowhere to do this, well, I shouldn't say nowhere. I had published first at Current Affairs and I'm really grateful for Current Affairs for that. It was an opportunity that I don't think would have emerged from other kinds of outlets. And later on, when, I started to launch Bad Faith, initially, I'm a kind of a risk averse person. I'm the kind of person who went to law school because she didn't know what to do, right? So I would have been happy to have, a podcast deal and a guaranteed salary and, health insurance and not have to worry about marketing and branding. And oh my gosh, can I get subscribers? Who knows? It was all very speculative. And so, the podcast was shopped around and the hope was that Spotify or somebody would buy the podcast. And there was not really any interest, which I thought was really interesting because, there were some kind of proven hosts involved and there wasn't an appetite. It's also interesting, by the way, because there's been a lot of conversation in the last couple of weeks about Spotify and how difficult it is for them to find new podcasts and talent that survives and all of this. And, they would love to find people on the left, but they can't find any. They had an opportunity and they passed on it. So I think a lot of leftists encounter that reality that there is an appetite among the masses for a certain kind of journalism and a certain kind of coverage. But that even though there is real monetary incentive even for these corporations to buy in, you don't see that on the left. And look at an example like Breaking Points. It's a show that started on the Hill with Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty. Crystal Ball is a leftist, Sagar is a libertarian, and there was an enormous appetite for a show where people with different political perspectives could talk about their differences, but also agree on some big ticket items like anti-imperialism, for example. And, there was, the Hill at first didn't even really appreciate what they had on their hands. And when Sagar and Crystal ended up leaving and start their own show, they have a huge subscriber base and they get an enormous amount of clicks and hits on YouTube. I mean, the appetite is enormous. And even though clearly everybody wants to see that, like people are tired of kind of the smug liberal pundit saying, deplorable, and they're tired of the smug Tucker Carlson right-wing pundit saying immigrants bad or whatever. You don't see on either channel any effort to get people in good faith conversation with each other. So without these independent platforms, without, the YouTubes and the Patreons and the ability to just like post your own RSS feed and go, you wouldn't see anything. You wouldn't see Crystal, you wouldn't see Jordan, you wouldn't see myself, you wouldn't see any number of people who provide space for, frankly, where the majority of Americans are politically. And I think that's why some of these platform conversations that get focused on individual actors are really missing the forest for the trees, because at any moment, any of these platforms could make decisions that would disproportionately affect the left. Censorship decisions often disproportionately affect the left. And I am incredibly grateful that, Spotify passed because, I have my own freedoms, and it's nice to be accessible. And I love to have the creative control and political control that I have over the podcast. But also, it is concerning that even from a capitalist perspective, there is no appetite for left media. And so I'm very appreciative of everybody who does support it. And I encourage everybody to go and support Status Quo if you can't financially. Even just clicking on the video, subscribing, and sharing to these kinds of shows is really helpful.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'll also just say that I encourage everyone to check out Bad Faith Pod as well. But I think, one thing that listeners of your podcast really appreciate about you as a journalist and a public figure, that you use your creativity in a way to sort of expose and push back against political violence, even and perhaps particularly, and this is something you've done throughout your career, when it isn't necessarily politically expedient or politically popular. And I know a lot of folks were introduced to your work when you worked on the Bernie campaign. And I think people are curious, like, how did you navigate institutions in the campaign and through that work that legitimized much of the status quo, be that, the two-party system, we talked about the Fourth Estate, but while also holding fast to these principles of exposing political violence and corporate violence?
Yeah, being on a campaign was different. When I joined The Intercept, I felt liberated. It was the first time when there was in my life where I felt really validated in a professional context. And there was a palpable appetite for my opinions. I was a senior and an editor, but also an opinion writer, and sitting in those pitch meetings and feeling like people actually wanted to hear what I had to say instead of me, at the law firm, like trying to be invisible and not bump into people in the hallway. It was such a refreshing change of pace, and I loved it. And when the Bernie campaign reached out and asked me to join, I kind of thought it was going to be a continuation of this brand new world where people actually valued my opinion. And, it was a little different than that. And when you work for a campaign, you ultimately are representing the principle, which was mostly fine because unlike most politicians, I had, 95% simpatico with Bernie. I don't know that I could ever be a press secretary for 99% of people because I don't have level of simpatico and I'm not, a good liar. I don't see myself, running cover for some milquetoast centrists or being put in a position. I have friends who work for the Biden administration who share my politics and are kind of put in the position in their professional capacities to have to defend stuff that in their personal life they don't think is defensible, and provides real wear and tear on the psyche. So being a part of the campaign, there were these moments where the approach that I might have taken, being able to be explicitly critical of other candidates, kind of call out, let's say, there was this kind of famous moment during the campaign where a surrogate, Zephyr Teachout, wrote an article in The Guardian that was good and truthful about Joe Biden being corrupt. And the campaign didn't stand behind it. And, Bernie, came out and said, no, I don't believe Joe Biden is corrupt. He's my friend. And so there were these moments where there was tensions where people within the campaign would have had taken a different approach than Senator Sanders, would have been more adversarial than Senator Sanders was willing to be, in ways that I think, my view is that it really would have helped him to have that sharper institutional critique that he had in 2016 when there was no hesitation in calling out Hillary Clinton as a corrupt politician, for instance. And what do I know? I'm fairly new to politics, and ultimately one has to defer to the judgment of the principal. But it was a really interesting first time up at bat to look at how one, in the context of the institution that is a campaign, negotiates those differences and tensions. And everyone's just trying to read their room and put their finger in the air and figure out what is going to work. And it's difficult because sometimes you have an inkling, but you have enough of an inkling to really advocate that a principal should do something that does have some risks attached to it. And, millions of people are invested in the outcome of this thing. And it could be the difference between, 68,000 people dying every year from a lack of health insurance or not. Are you that confident in your approach? Are you that confident in the thing that you want them to do? Um, but more pointedly to your point about institutional power, my belief is that that is the critique that lands the best. It's the critique that everybody intuitively understands. I think it's a critique that sometimes gets diluted in a liberal context into just just not just in terms of minimizing it, but just as in narrowing it superficial, unnecessarily to a kind of like structural racism critique. But it's bigger than that. It's inclusive of, in addition to that. And I think there are a lot of Americans of all races that have such a hungry appetite for a more pointed critique of power more broadly, and want to hear about how racism fits into that broader power dynamic. And there is research, in fact, that shows that that is the most effective kind of messaging. We talked to Heather McGee on the podcast last year, who used to be at Demos and who did this study, and now has written this book about what she calls drain pool politics, and how the best messaging that gets across to persuadable voters is to talk about how racism is a tool to divide us up so that corporate elites can maintain power. It's about a combined message and how that's most effective. And I think that it is essential that people who are doing racial advocacy include that material power analysis and vice versa, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it works. It works. It works.
That is so brilliant. And I think we have a minute left, but I want to get one quick question in before we have to end, which is, you wrote this great piece on the strategic efficacy of forcing a Medicare for all vote. And in that piece, you also wrote that the moral cause for action requires no strategic justification. And I thought that was really brilliant, and sort of to build on the strategy of what you just articulated. Like, do you see your work or perhaps independent media and journalism more broadly as popularizing the moral cause for action? And I just want to end by asking, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, what's so interesting is that, well, let me just speak for myself, but I think other people feel this way. We're like inculcated with all of these great moral beliefs. We're little kids who find out that, a little YouTube video of the kid who realizes that he's eating an octopus and then he gets really upset and wants to be a vegetarian. Like, that's how we all kind of start out. And when there are all these wonderful traditions, where be they spiritual or cultural or religious, that tell us how to do the good thing and be the right person and all of that stuff that we learn in kindergarten. And then at some point we start feeling like insecure about trying to live those values. And there are all of these off ramps that are provided for us to say it's okay if we aren't doing our best. No one else really is. Okay, it's a dog eat dog world. You got to fend for yourself. Everybody's eating the hot dog at the barbecue. I eat meat. This isn't like a shaming thing, but like I also appreciate that, there are a lot of social signals that tell me that I shouldn't even be aspiring to do better, to like minimize my meat to once a week or whatever. And it goes so far as to, at some point, I almost feel like I felt a sense of cringe or embarrassment if I cared too much about the polar bears, or, wanted to walk another block and recycle this can, or, like, it's almost like an embarrassment about being crunchy and granola and trying too hard at a certain point when you grow up. And what I personally felt in the context of the Bernie campaign in 2016, it wasn't that I was being taught about any kind of moral imperatives, but what I felt was permission to express the moral imperatives that I've always felt very deeply, and that I think a lot of people, most people, feel from the time they're children on. Permission to say that this isn't some like weird crunchy granola, like Washington State vibes thing that I'm feeling. Like, this isn't Portlandia. Like, this is okay, and we're all in this together. And my God, if we all actually linked up and tried this together, we could actually accomplish a thing, and not just like ban straws in the cafeteria or whatever. And that is, I think, the goal. That is, I think, the objective of lefty media. It's to give people permission to continue to fight. And that, to me, was what was so powerful about Force the Vote. it happened at a moment where so many people were demoralized, because whatever you feel about Bernie as an individual, the movement made people feel connected in a sense of promise and that things could actually change. And we don't have to just keep sitting around talking about the polar bears and the ice caps ad nauseum, like we've been doing since 1994, in elementary school. Not you guys. You guys weren't born in 1994 or something. I don't know. I can't do math. But the point is, I think that there's so much power, and it's such a threat to the establishment for people to actually believe that there can be change, not naively, not in like a hashtag hope and change sort of way, but the knowledge that there is so much people power that exists, and that you're not foolish or immature or naive to actually believe that you can change something. Now, how change happens is a really important question, and people need to be really realistic about that. And I think really internalize that it's going to be a lot more uncomfortable, a lot more adversarial, and require a lot more risk than the popular narratives about social change are, which again is why I'm so grateful to have been able to have had Lana Guinier as a professor. But the risks are lowered, and it is less hard the more people get involved, and it's a real collective action problem. And if left media can help solve that collection action problem and get more people onboarded and more people realizing they're not alone, if it can get people participating in something like Force the Vote and planning Medicare for All marches and keeping a movement alive even after everybody in Washington seems to have forgotten about all of the urgency with which we spoke about these progressive issues in the context of the 2016 and 2020 campaigns, then I think we're doing something right. And it feels like a real privilege to be a part of that.
Briahna, unbelievable. So great to see you. Thank you for joining us. I'm not actually closing us out, but since I was invited up, I wanted to say hello and say,
Hi, it's so good to see you, Professor Hanson. You have to come on Bad Faith Pod.